In 1979, the Whitaker family vanished without a trace during a brutal Montana blizzard. Decades later, a renovation crew at the long-abandoned farmhouse uncovers something buried in the soot-blackened fireplace. What they find leads to one of the most chilling revelations in small-town history. The wind howled like a living creature across the flat expanse of Red Willow County, Montana. Snow peeled off tree branches and danced in the pale light of a setting sun as the Whitaker farmhouse creaked under the weight of a sky threatening to collapse. The radio crackled its final warning blizzard expected to drop more than 3 feet overnight travel ill-advised temperatures plunging below zero. Yet inside the modest 2-story farmhouse, the Whitaker family moved with quiet routine. Thomas Whitaker, a reserved cattleman known for his precision and solemn stare, was stacking more wood by the fireplace, his eyes flickering with calculation rather than worry. His wife Eleanor was in the kitchen, plating up a modest meal of stew and cornbread, her apron smeared with flour, humming softly to a hymn that had no words. Their children, Ben 12 and little Abigail 8, raced down the stairs, flushed from an upstairs game of flashlight tag. The farmhouse smelled of cedar smoke and slow-cooked beef. Outside, however, the temperature had dropped like a hammer. The Whitakers had lived in this house for over a decade. It sat at the end of a gravel road most people forgot existed. Their nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. People in town respected Thomas, but never quite knew what to make of him. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. Some said he'd seen too much in Vietnam. Others said the loss of his first child to illness a decade earlier had drained something essential from him. Whatever it was, he lived deliberately, ran his household by quiet command, and trusted only what he could fence in. At 7:14 p.m., as the first flakes began to fall thick as cotton, Eleanor set the stew on the table and called the family to eat. They held hands in silence, as was their ritual before Thomas spoke a few low words of grace. Then they ate. No one could have known that this meal would be their last, that this precise moment, spoons dipping into steaming broth, the crackle of fire behind them, would be the final snapshot of the Whitakers alive. Outside, snow thickened into a curtain. Winds grew violent. The storm hit harder than expected, gusts of 60-pep drifts swallowing fences, power lines bowing under ice. By 10:30 p.m., the house was dark. The generator sputtered once and died. Somewhere deep in the night, a sharp scream, or maybe just a gust of wind, cut across the valley. The next morning, no one could reach the Whitakers. Their phone line was down, and even the most snow-ready neighbors couldn't traverse the buried road. It wasn't until the third day, once plows had cleared a path, that someone made it to the farmhouse. It was Marlene Price, their neighbor from 2 miles east, who first approached. She was bundled in layers, face half frozen by the time she reached the porch. Something immediately felt wrong. The front door was ajar, no footprints in the snow. Inside the house was bitterly cold, but eerily intact. No broken glass, no signs of struggle, just absence. Dinner sat congealed and half-eaten on the table. One bowl tipped over. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only gray ash and a faint soot stain along the hearthstone. Upstairs beds were unmade, children's clothes strewn where they had been tossed. The family was simply gone. Sheriff Raymond Clark arrived with deputies within the hour. He walked the perimeter, checked all rooms, even searched the barn. No signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, no note. It was as if the snowstorm had lifted the family right out of their home. Thomas's truck was still in the drive, half buried. His keys hung on the hook by the back door. The sheriff, a man of logic and lean muscle, found himself rattled. It was too clean, too intact. Nothing made sense. And in Montana, things usually made sense. By dusk, a missing persons report had gone statewide. Flyers printed. Dogs brought in. Helicopters sent overhead, nothing. No tracks, No blood, no clues. A family of 4 had vanished from inside their home during a blizzard with no one to see or hear a thing. The townspeople responded with food drives, prayer circles, and gossip. Some believed the family had staged it, fled debts or danger. Others whispered darker tales. Wasn't it odd they said that Thomas hadn't shown up for his vet appointment the week prior? Wasn't Eleanor's sister supposed to visit but never did? And wasn't there always something distant in Thomas's eyes? But weeks passed, then months, and nothing came. Eventually the house was boarded up. The land declared dormant, not for sale, but not maintained. A silent monument to a family consumed by a storm and a mystery no one could explain. 44 years would pass before the first real answer came, and it would begin with a spark from a hammer against brick decades later in that very same hearth. 44 years later, the Whitaker farmhouse had become more myth than memory in Red Willow County. It stood like a forgotten relic, its paint faded to a soft gray-green and shutters flapping loose like tired wings. Locals told stories about the place, how the wind sounded different when it passed through those trees, how no snow ever seemed to stick to the roof for long, how animals refused to linger near the property lines. Children dared one another to throw rocks at the window. Teenagers took late-night drives down the gravel road and swore they saw lights moving inside. But the county had changed in those 4 decades. Ranches were sold to developers. Oil rigs moved in. What had once been wild and open was now partitioned and purchased. In 2023, the Whitaker house was bought sight unseen by a young couple from Denver, Jude and Lila Marston, looking for cheap land and fresh air. The Marstons were newly married, eager to restore the old house and raise goats on the surrounding acreage. They'd heard the ghost stories, sure, but neither believed them. "We love a good fixer-upper," Lila had joked to the real estate agent. Jude, a structural engineer with a penchant for historical preservation, was fascinated by the bones of the place. It had good timber, sturdy foundations, and no major roof damage despite its age. They moved in late September, and by October they were gutting the living room. On a crisp Thursday morning, Jude stood kneeling at the fireplace, prying up the fire brick lining with a mallet and chisel. The hearth had been filled with decades of soot and cinders. Jude wanted to rebuild the chimney with modern lining and expose the original brick for aesthetic charm. As he lifted one cracked tile, a sudden shift in weight caused the floor below it to collapse inward. A section of the hearth caved in, releasing a rush of ash and dust into the room. Jude cursed and backed away. Lila rushed in coughing as a blackened swirl of soot clouded the air. But it wasn't just ash that spilled out. Among the rubble was something small and curved, calcified and pale. At first glance, it looked like part of a thick twig or a deformed piece of plaster. But Jude, trained in load-bearing materials and architectural decay, saw it for what it was: bone. Tiny, charred, human. The next morning, the sheriff's department arrived with a forensic team. The new sheriff, Andrea Clark, was the granddaughter of the very same Raymond Clark who had first walked through that house in 1979. She had grown up hearing the Whitaker story, though she'd always regarded it with professional detachment. This could be an animal fragment the crime scene tech offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not," Jude said flatly, arms crossed. "I know load fractures, wood deterioration, and chimney debris." This was placed. The fireplace cavity was carefully excavated brick by crumbling brick. Within hours, more fragments were found, fingertip-sized bone shards, some broken vertebrae, and most damningly, a jaw fragment with 2 molars still intact. No skull, no long bones, but enough for the lab. DNA confirmation came within the week. The remains belonged to Eleanor Whitaker. The town erupted. News vans crowded the county's only gas station. Microphones chased down old-timers who remembered Eleanor's laugh or Thomas's 1,000-yard stare. Facebook groups bloomed with conspiracy theories, rekindled interest, and a tide of amateur sleuths. How had she ended up in the fireplace? Where were the others? And why had no one thought to look there before? Sheriff Clark reopened the case. It was officially reclassified as a homicide. The house was declared a crime scene. The Marstons were temporarily relocated to a motel in nearby Great Falls, and forensics began a slow and methodical dig through the structure walls, floorboards, basement, attic. The town waited. Within weeks, another discovery followed, this time beneath a section of floorboard behind the pantry. Tucked between joists, they found a small leather-bound journal. Pages ruined from water damage, ink smeared, but a few entries legible. March 3, 1979. He's not the same. He walks at night. Abigail saw him at the barn last night, holding the lantern and talking to himself. I told her it was a dream, but I'm scared. March 4, 1979. The storm is coming. He keeps the cellar locked now. I tried the key. It's changed. March 5, 1979. I saw him at the fireplace after we ate. Just sitting, not moving, watching the flames. He's building something inside it. I can't tell what. I miss my sister. I want to go home. The journal ended there. The discovery shook everything. The official theory that the Whitakers had been victims of a natural disaster or mass abduction was no longer tenable. Eleanor had feared her own husband. She'd seen him doing something in the fireplace, and now her bones had been found there. Sheriff Clark expanded the search beyond the house. Cadaver dogs were brought in, soil samples taken. The barn, the cellar, even the well sealed shut for decades were subjected to forensic scans. Then came a new lead, unexpected and chilling. A rusted iron key jammed into a crack behind the wood stove in the kitchen. It matched the lock on the root cellar's exterior door, one that no one had been able to open in 40 years. On November 5th, under pale gray skies and the gaze of 20 reporters, Sheriff Clark turned the key. The padlock gave with a sharp pop, and the door creaked open, releasing a breath of stale metallic air from the depths. They descended slowly. What they found would shift the story from tragedy to something far darker. The root cellar was far larger than expected, almost a labyrinth. Sheriff Clark and her team stepped into the cold darkness, flashlights cutting through layers of dust, mildew, and time. The air was dense, a sour cocktail of rotted wood and rusted iron. Stone walls flanked them on both sides, and the steps descended farther than the original blueprints of the house had ever indicated. Jude Marston stood at the top of the stairs, watching with unease. "We'd always thought this was just a storm shelter," he said to Lila, who hovered beside him. "Maybe 8 by 10 feet max." What the team uncovered below was a series of chambers, some partially collapsed, others remarkably intact. The first room held preserved shelves of canned food jars, still sealed but bloated and blackened. The next room was stranger. It had been outfitted like a bunker, a cot, a writing desk, a cracked mirror. On the floor, a yellowed newspaper from March 1979 was neatly folded beside a rusted tin of matches. Then came the final chamber. Smaller, isolated, the walls, scorched and blistered. Here, beneath a cracked ceiling beam, they found what no one had dared to imagine: more bones. Arranged, intentionally. The skeletal remains of 2 children lay side by side on a faded wool blanket. A porcelain doll, its face cracked and grimed, sat between them. Tucked under one arm was a child's mitten, still damp with mildew. Next to the bodies sat a Bible open to a burned-through page of Psalms. The forensic team fell into immediate silence. Dr. Halverson, the state pathologist, knelt down and carefully lifted one of the skulls. "These children didn't die in their sleep," she said grimly. "There's trauma here. Blunt force." Sheriff Clark stepped back, hand on her holster, as if she expected the shadows to move. "Where's Thomas?" she asked aloud. The bodies were soon confirmed, Abigail and Joseph Whitaker, aged 8 and 10 at the time of disappearance. The jawbone found in the fireplace belonged to Eleanor. But Thomas Whitaker, the patriarch, remained unaccounted for. The narrative shifted overnight. The community, once nostalgic about the mystery of the vanished family, now stared into a darker story of isolation, possible madness, and domestic terror sealed in stone. Local papers printed side-by-side photographs, a younger Thomas Whitaker smiling beside his students at the schoolhouse, and the eerie cellar chamber where his children were found. What had happened in that house? And more urgently, what had happened to Thomas? Sheriff Clark reopened the Whitaker family's entire history. She combed through old tax records, utility bills, and Thomas's employment file. She learned that Thomas had taken a sudden leave of absence in February 1979. His request had cited illness and spiritual fatigue. He had never returned. In Eleanor's journal, Clark found one more detail that had escaped earlier scrutiny, a line scrawled in a different pen, pressed hard enough to leave impressions in the page. "He says we must be tested by fire." It was a quote Thomas had repeated in his final sermon at the small Methodist church before he resigned from the congregation. He had claimed the world was ending, that God's wrath would come not from the sky but from within the hearth of man. That single sentence shook Clark to her core. She began to suspect Thomas hadn't vanished at all. Maybe he'd never intended to leave the house. The search intensified. Scans were conducted around the property, ground-penetrating radar thermal imaging. The barn was stripped to the rafters. Beneath a loose corner of the foundation, hidden under decades of hay and detritus, officers discovered a hatch. Another door. This one was sealed with steel bolts and covered by a rotted rug. Inside was a narrow tunnel, dirt walls reinforced with timber. At the end, a small chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. A single chair. A single body. Or what remained of it. The skeleton was curled forward, arms crossed over its chest. In front of it, a burned notebook. A rusted .38 revolver. And behind the head, an entry wound to the skull, cracked and caved inward. A spent casing still lay beside the bones. Dr. Halverson confirmed male. Approximately 40-50 years old. Trauma consistent with suicide by firearm. A locket was found on the body, a photo of Eleanor and the children. It was Thomas, the man who had built his family a home, then a tomb. Who had constructed chambers beneath the earth, telling himself they were for survival. Who in his final moments had written pages no one would ever fully decipher. Only a handful of words survived in the notebook's last page. They begged me to stop. I heard them even after the fire. The investigation was closed with heavy hearts. The official conclusion, murder-suicide fueled by psychosis, possibly exacerbated by religious mania, isolation, and the pressures of the blizzard. The remains were reburied together, this time in the county cemetery. The headstone read, "The Whitaker family, together in rest." But the town didn't quite settle. Rumors persisted. About the dreams people had near the property. About the lights seen moving behind cracked curtains. About the whispers caught on baby monitors by the new residents. The Marstons never returned to the house. They sold the property for a fraction of the purchase price and moved back to Denver. The Whitaker house remains empty to this day, boarded and sealed. Nature slowly reclaims its walls, and the snow always seems to fall heavier there, as if the wind remembers. Spring arrived in Cheshire Hollow, with its usual quiet thaw, the snow melting into memory. But the horror unearthed in the Whitaker cellar clung like a shadow over the town. Local children avoided the bend in County Road 7 where the Whitaker property stood, and even the town's most skeptical elders grew hesitant to discuss the case in public. The house had become a silent landmark, not of history, but of warning. Yet while law enforcement considered the case closed, Lila Marston couldn't let it go. She wasn't a believer in ghost stories or old curses, But something about the final words in Thomas Whitaker's scorched notebook haunted her in a way that no logical explanation could erase. They begged me to stop. I heard them even after the fire. The sentence played on a loop in her mind. Unable to sleep one night, Lila dove back into the photographs she and her husband had taken before the cellar discovery. There was one from the upstairs hallway, a warped mirror, the glass streaked with grime. Behind it, at an odd angle, she thought she saw something, an outline in the wall paneling. She enlarged the image on her laptop, eyes narrowing. It wasn't just a smudge, it was a seam. She returned to the house alone the next morning. Jude had refused to ever set foot inside again, and law enforcement had deemed the structure sealed, but the police tape flapped loose in the wind. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan. She moved carefully, climbing the old stairs to the second floor. The hallway felt tighter than she remembered, the air warmer, heavier. She paused in front of the mirror. There it was, clear now, a faint rectangular cut in the paneling. Gently, she pried at the edge with a screwdriver. A square of wood popped loose. Behind it was a hollow space about a foot deep, enough to fit something small. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin box. It was old, embossed with a faded red cross. A first aid kit. She carried it downstairs, hands trembling. Inside the box were objects that chilled her to the bone. A bundle of children's teeth tied with twine, a silver brooch smeared with dried blood, and a page torn from the Bible Job 3017 underlined in red ink. The night pierces my bones, my gnawing pains never rest. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but to Lila, it was a confession. Proof that Thomas Whitaker had descended deeper into madness than anyone imagined. She brought the box to Sheriff Clark, who reopened the scene briefly. But without new bodies or living suspects, it was only an artifact, a grim token of an already horrifying conclusion. Then came the anonymous letter. It arrived at the sheriff's office in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from Missouri. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. You think he did it. But there was someone else. He was never alone. No signature, no fingerprints, no DNA. The letter reignited curiosity and panic in equal measure. Who had sent it? A crank, an accomplice, a survivor. Sheriff Clark scoured old files again, looking for names of former friends, visitors, employees. One name resurfaced: Silas Rayner, a local handyman who had worked on the Whitaker property during the winter of 1978. A man with a minor criminal record, petty theft, assault charges, but no clear motive. He had disappeared just 2 weeks after the Whitakers. His file was thin. His last known address was in Durango, Colorado, but he had never officially left a forwarding address. Clark submitted a request for federal assistance. The FBI opened a limited investigation, but turned up nothing substantial. Then 2 weeks later, another envelope appeared, this time at Lila's home. It was tucked beneath the doormat, with no postmark, no tracking. Inside was a Polaroid. A black and white photo, aged and faded but unmistakable. A man standing in front of the Whitaker fireplace. The same fireplace that had been torn apart during the bone discovery. The photo was dated March 3rd, 1979. The man was not Thomas. Lila brought the photo to Sheriff Clark, who confirmed it. The face matched Silas Rayner. They now had reason to believe Silas had been there after the family was presumed dead. The working theory shifted again. Perhaps Thomas had retreated into madness, but Silas had stayed behind or returned to finish what had started. Had the Whitakers been lured into the cellar, trapped, burned alive while someone watched? A third message arrived, this one hand-delivered to the sheriff's home address. It was a child's drawing, crude but chilling. Stick figures around a fire. A taller figure holding a shovel. On the back, a scrawled note: he wasn't the only monster in that house. The sheriff had the Whitaker property cordoned off indefinitely. FBI agents arrived and began a new round of forensics, digging into the soil beneath the house, inside the cellar walls, even scanning nearby woods. They found nothing new. No more bodies. No sign of Silas. The house, despite yielding so many horrors, held its final secrets close. Then in June, Lila received a final letter. No envelope, just a page pinned to her front door with an old nail. It read, "Fire doesn't destroy everything. Some sins burn louder than screams." After that, nothing else came. No more letters, no sightings of Silas Rayner, no updates from the FBI. But for those who had seen the inside of the Whitaker house, who had stood where the children died, where the mother's bones were burned in her own hearth, they didn't need more. The evil was already too real. The town of Cheshire Hollow slowly tried to return to normal. But for those touched by the re-emerging Whitaker mystery, peace remained elusive. Lila Marston especially was unable to disengage. Each night she lay in bed thinking about the messages, the artifacts, the implication of more than one killer. The letters had stopped, but their weight lingered like smoke from a long dead fire. She wasn't alone in her unrest. Sheriff Clark began noticing strange occurrences near the Whitaker property. First, it was the motion sensors installed by the FBI triggered 3 times in 1 week. Each time a deputy responded, but there was no sign of entry, no footprints in the soft ground. Then a trail camera set on a tree outside the house was smashed. Its plastic casing melted as if held over flame. Then came the whispering. It began with one of the agents, Cara Delaney, who reported hearing a child's voice during a sweep of the basement. Soft like humming, but with no source. She was laughed off by others until 2 more agents claimed to hear the same thing a week later. They brought in audio equipment, but nothing was captured. Still, it was enough for Cara to request reassignment. Lila had become obsessed with the idea that Silas Rayner or someone else connected to the Whitakers had returned. She began canvassing nearby towns, asking about transient men in their 60s with burn scars, an old rumor from Rayner's youth. In a tiny feed store on the outskirts of Carver's Mill, a clerk remembered someone. A man who paid in cash, kept his face turned, and bought only canned beans and bandages. He limped, the clerk added. Smelled like wood smoke. Lila returned to the sheriff with the information, and Clark drove out with 2 deputies to investigate. The store owner gave them a vague direction east toward the abandoned logging cabins near Bearskin Ridge. They found a shack. Not much half-collapsed windows, missing roof patched with a tarp. Inside were signs of recent habitation, canned food, a cot, an oil lantern. And taped to the wall, yellowing from age, was a newspaper clipping. The 1979 Cheshire Hollow Ledger front page, "Local family feared dead in blizzard." Next to it, a photo of Thomas Whitaker cut from the same issue. Beneath it, in black marker, the words, "He deserved it." A deeper search of the shack revealed something far more disturbing. Beneath the cot, buried in a plastic bin, were journals. Dozens. Spiral-bound notebooks filled with erratic handwriting sketches and what appeared to be confessions. Sheriff Clark, flanked by his deputies, read the first entry aloud. To March 6, 1979. He lit the fire, but I locked the door. I heard her screaming. I didn't unlock it. I told her to hush. God forgives the weak, but I wasn't weak. The confession was chilling, and it wasn't Thomas's handwriting. It was Silas Rayner's. Other entries followed. He thought the cellar would end them, but I knew they'd come back. They always come back. I see them sometimes in the smoke. I buried the locket near the cedar grove. No one should wear that again. Not after what she did with it. Not after what she saw. Lila's hands trembled as she flipped through one journal. The dates spanned from 1979 through 2012, decades of paranoia visions, cryptic memories, and clear signs of psychological unraveling. But the locket stood out. It was the only physical object mentioned with a location. Sheriff Clark organized a small team to search the cedar grove, referenced in the journals. It took 3 days, but they eventually found it, a heart-shaped gold locket, buried in a rusted cookie tin beneath a cairn of rocks. Inside the locket were 2 photographs, A young girl, perhaps 8, with long braids. On the other side, a woman, presumably the mother. Both bore signs of damage burn marks, as if someone had tried to destroy them. With the journals and the locket, they had proof Silas had not only remained in the area for years, he had fixated on the Whitakers even after their deaths. Whether driven by guilt delusion or deeper malice, he had continued to haunt their memory and their home. The FBI officially closed the case with a revised report, co-conspirator confirmed in Whitaker family deaths, suspect likely deceased. But closure was a strange thing. In late August, Lila returned to the Whitaker house one final time. It had been sold to the county, scheduled for demolition. She walked through the empty rooms, each one echoing with the quiet history of the tragedy. She paused at the fireplace, the same one where the bone had been found. And there inside the hearth was a single object not seen before. A child's shoe, untouched by ash. Fresh. She didn't tell anyone. She placed the shoe in her bag and walked outside, locking the door behind her for the last time. As she stood at the end of the long drive, wind kicking dust through the air, she whispered a quiet goodbye. To the children who never made it out, to the mother who died protecting them, and to the monsters both real and imagined who had haunted this place for far too long. The demolition of the Whitaker house took place under a gray October sky. Rain had slicked the earth into mud, making the work of the bulldozers and backhoes all the more grueling. Onlookers gathered, some out of morbid curiosity, others like Lila and Sheriff Clark out of solemn necessity. Each beam that cracked, each wall that collapsed felt like an exhale, as if the land had been holding its breath for 44 years. But not everything gave way easily. When crews reached the back section of the house where the basement's crawl space extended furthest, their equipment hit something dense. At first they assumed it was more of the poured concrete foundation, but as the workers dug by hand to preserve what they could, they uncovered not concrete but stacked stone, and behind it a false wall. It had not been on any blueprint or structural record. Sheriff Clark, now on site full-time, ordered the area cordoned off. What lay behind the false wall turned speculation into certainty, a hidden chamber untouched by time. Inside, the air was dry cold. The narrow room, barely large enough for a grown man to lie flat, contained 2 items. A wooden bench nailed to the far end, and on it a box. Metal corroded but intact with a padlock long since rusted through. Lila stood beside Clark as he opened it. Inside the box was a stack of old photographs, a bundle of singed letters tied with twine, and something no one expected, a half-melted plastic cassette recorder. Next to it, a note scrawled in Sharpie. "If you found this, then the fire didn't finish what I started." The sheriff turned to Lila. "We're going to the lab with this. Tonight." That night, in a windowless FBI evidence room, technicians worked tirelessly to clean the old tape recorder. With gloves and the utmost care, they restored enough of the corroded audio strip to make a partial play possible. When they hit play, the room went dead silent. Static crackled first, then a faint voice, masculine, shaky, murmuring. "Thomas, it wasn't supposed to be like that." She locked the door. I saw her, her face in the window, then a pause. She thought it would save them. She thought I would burn too. But I got out. I got out. Clark and Lila exchanged glances. The voice wasn't Thomas's. It was unmistakably Silas Rayner. More crackling, more fragments. I waited. I went back. The bodies were gone. All gone except her. She was still warm. Static overwhelmed the remainder. The implications were immediate and chilling. The long-standing assumption that all the Whitakers had perished simultaneously in the fire now seemed implausible. If Silas returned to the house after the fire and found her, then one of the Whitakers may have survived, if only for hours. But who and what had he done then? Lila and the FBI agent present, Derek Hallstrom, agreed the next step was identifying the woman mentioned in the tape. She was still warm, suggested it was the mother Elizabeth. But the tone implied he had done something more than just find her. An autopsy report from 1979 was ordered up from archives. Elizabeth's remains had been presumed identified through dental fragments, but the report was primitive by today's standards. No biological tissue had been saved, which left one option: the burned bone found in the fireplace. Lila obtained a court order to exhume it from evidence for modern DNA analysis. While the analysis was underway, Hallstrom made another discovery buried in one of the singed letters from the box. It had been written to someone named M, the initial used repeatedly throughout the journals found in the shack. The letter read, "I did what you said. I sealed the door like we practiced." They screamed, especially the little one. "I'm not proud, but you said it was the only way. You said the blood had to stop." There was no signature. Lila felt the edges of her sanity fray. If Silas had a partner, someone named M, then the entire narrative of the case was wrong. For days, she pored over town records, yearbooks, newspaper archives, anything that might yield a clue. The only consistent M linked to the Whitakers' circle was Martin Crowley Thomas's childhood friend, a reclusive loner who left Cheshire Hollow abruptly in early 1980 and never returned. Lila requested a background report. Crowley had changed his name in 1984, moved to Colorado, and worked odd jobs under the alias Mark Rowan. His last known address, a cabin in Gunnison County, deep in the Rockies. Hallstrom and Clark arranged a quiet visit with a local marshal's assistance. What they found confirmed every dread suspicion. The cabin was empty, but inside were photos, faded images of the Whitaker children, cut from school bulletins and class pictures. Dozens of them. Some bore markings, X's across faces, hearts around others. A single name repeated on the back of several: Sadie, the youngest Whitaker child. The implication was horrifying. Had Sadie survived the fire? Was she taken by Martin, by M? More urgently, was she still alive? Back in Cheshire Hollow, the DNA test results finally came in. The bone found in the fireplace did not belong to Elizabeth Whitaker. It belonged to Sadie, a child roughly age 5'7". Lila collapsed into a chair, eyes wide, mouth dry. The girl who haunted the house, the voice Kara heard in the basement, the small shoe left behind. She had never escaped. She died in the fire, which meant the photos in Crowley's cabin were not souvenirs of a kidnapped girl. They were trophies, and he had come back again and again, watching the place where his secret had once lived buried in ash. The revelation of Sadie Whitaker's true fate reverberated like a shockwave across Cheshire Hollow. News stations caught wind of the reopened case, the burned bone, the decades-lost cassette recording. People who'd long written the Whitaker tragedy off as a sad chapter now re-examined every rumor, every half-truth told in whispers. The haunted house had a name, a face, a child's face, but for Lila, the case was far from closed. In fact, it had deepened into something darker. Sadie's death, her bone in the fireplace, meant someone had returned after the fire, someone who still had access. And the photos found in Martin Crowley's cabin suggested not just obsession, but physical access to the property for years after it was abandoned, which begged a chilling question: had he lived there? While others thought the place empty. Sheriff Clark sent search teams into the deeper parts of the woods behind the Whitaker house. They fanned out with cadaver dogs and metal detectors, hoping for any hidden remnants of occupation campsites, buried evidence, even bones. What they found instead was a narrow trail camouflaged with purpose, snaking west into the forest. Half a mile in, they reached a clearing with a low-roofed lean-to shelter built from rotted timbers. Beneath a tarp lay a box of mason jars, each holding scraps of newspaper, burnt cloth, hair relics. Altars. On one jar, a photo had been duct-taped to the glass. It showed Sadie Whitaker asleep, maybe age 4 or 5, tucked beneath a flowered quilt. The caption read in a scrawl of blue ink, "My little bloom, still and soft." Lila's stomach turned. Clark took the jar from her hands and covered it. The team marked the site and collected everything. The FBI's behavioral unit was called in to profile the shrine and the man who built it. The profile they returned chilled Lila. According to the unit, Crowley had likely returned to Cheshire Hollow repeatedly over the years, possibly even living in the ruins or in the woods for short stints. The altars suggested fixation, but also remorse, a psychological loop of revisitation and penance. That he'd stayed close despite the risk was common in obsessive offenders. But the photos taken years after the fire, that was new. Lila pressed further, asking Hallstrom to revisit the photos from Crowley's cabin. Were there dates, printing formats? One of the prints taken in 1996 was from a disposable Kodak camera model that didn't exist until 1993. That meant Crowley was still taking new photos of the house 17 years after the fire. Could he have taken someone else? Lila asked, her voice brittle. Hallstrom didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table between them. Do you remember the missing girl from Glenvale in 1997? He asked. Lila nodded slowly. Carrie Matheson. Vanished walking home from piano lessons. 6 years old. He opened the folder. A side-by-side comparison had been made, one of Carrie's childhood photos and one of the anonymous children's faces from the cabin. Same dimples, same almond eyes. Lila leaned back, stunned. You think he kept taking girls? Hallstrom's tone was grim. At least one. Maybe more. A pattern was emerging, and Lila feared they were decades too late. They needed proof. A body. A living survivor. Anything. On a hunch, she returned to the lean-to with cadaver dogs and 2 specialized techs trained in ground-penetrating radar. The forest soil was thick with roots, decomposed leaves, and animal burrows. But just off the edge of the clearing, the radar pinged, a hollow spot. They dug carefully. A foot down the shovel hit wood. It was a small coffin, hand-built, weathered. Inside lay the bones of a child, wrapped in a decaying yellow blanket, with a teddy bear whose button eyes had long since fallen off. DNA tests later confirmed the worst. It was Carrie Matheson, gone 26 years, buried just steps from where Crowley had preserved his memories of Sadie Whittaker. The scale of horror began to dawn. Crowley hadn't just mourned Sadie. He'd tried to replace her with girls who resembled her. Lila's mind flashed back to the voice on the cassette, repeating, she was still warm. Crowley may have killed Elizabeth Whittaker. He may have returned for Sadie. But it was possible, maybe even likely, that the fire wasn't a spontaneous act of madness. It had been orchestrated to remove a family that stood in the way of his obsession. Back in town, a historian contacted Lila. She'd seen the news coverage and dug through an old box of yearbooks. She found a photo from 1965, an elementary class portrait. On the bottom row sat Thomas Whittaker and Martin Crowley. But what caught Lila's eye was the girl next to them. Same brown curls, same faint dimple, labeled only Sadie Bloom. The original Sadie, the girl Martin had loved as a child, perhaps even obsessed over. She died in a boating accident in 1969. Lila whispered, that's what started it. He lost her. And then years later met the Whittakers, found another girl who looked just like his Sadie, befriended Thomas, inserted himself. And when that illusion was threatened, he burned it all down. Sheriff Clark sat across from Lila in the precinct conference room that night. Neither said anything for a long time. Finally, Clark broke the silence. We ever gonna find Crowley? Lila didn't answer directly, but she thought of the fire, the tape, the shrine, the grave, and how every one of them felt like a letter sent too late. The air in Cheshire Hollow shifted. It wasn't relief, it was dread, coiled and unfinished. Now the town knew Crowley hadn't died in the fire, that he'd returned, that the name Sadie wasn't just a fixation, but a resurrection copied and reenacted across victims. Sadie Bloom, Sadie Whittaker, Carrie Matheson, and maybe others. The FBI dubbed it the Sadie pattern. Lila spent her evenings combing missing children databases. Girls aged 4 to 7 gone between 1980 and 2000. She pulled those with specific traits: brown hair, brown eyes, dimples. The list grew longer than she expected. Some were from neighboring states. Some from towns just like Cheshire Hollow, small, forgettable, with quiet bus stops and empty playgrounds. Crowley had hidden in plain sight. And the more Lila looked, the more she felt the burn of guilt for the assumption, the closure forced on the Whitakers case decades ago. For not seeing the fire as a mask instead of a tragedy. Sheriff Clark, meanwhile, had different concerns. Crowley's bones had not been found. The foundation remains. Beneath the Whitaker house had revealed fragments, charred, partial, likely animal. The forensics team had originally declared one set to be Crowley's, but after testing with newer methods, it was confirmed none of them belonged to him. He was never in that fire. And worse, he might still be alive. The oldest sighting linked to him dated to 2007, a convenience store in western Colorado. A man in a brown overcoat had paid for gas in cash, then slipped a photo from his pocket at checkout, a faded picture of a brown-haired girl sleeping beneath a patchwork quilt. The clerk remembered the photo, remembered how the man had stared at it longer than seemed normal. When he looked up, he said, "She's the only one who never cried." The credit card machine was down that day. No security cameras. The man drove a pickup with no plates. That was 16 years ago. The FBI launched a manhunt, quiet, shadowed. No media. They didn't want to spook him. Back in Cheshire, Hollow Hallstrom arranged for forensic excavation beneath the Whitaker house's hearth. Ground-penetrating radar had shown a strange pocket near the Fireplace foundation, a cavity the size of a crawlspace previously overlooked. The dig was surgical. They broke through rusted piping and beams, then reached something unexpected: concrete flooring, smooth and deliberate. Beneath that, a hatch. It led to a tiny basement room unrecorded in the blueprints. Walls lined with faded wallpaper, a child's cot in the corner, and a rocking chair carved from pine. Everything was perfectly preserved, clean, empty, except for the music box on the floor. It was shaped like a ballerina's stage dustless wound once before. When Lila turned the key, a quiet lullaby played, hauntingly soft. "Hush, little baby." She froze. That was the melody Sadie hummed on the cassette tape. They weren't just memories Crowley was chasing. He was rebuilding them. The implication was chilling. Sadie had been kept in that room, not immediately burned in the fire. She'd been hidden. Lila realized with a nauseous twist someone had returned after the fire descended that same hidden stairwell and taken her, which made Lila question everything. Had Crowley intended to kill the family? Or was the fire merely a distraction to separate Sadie to create the illusion of her death? What if Sadie hadn't died in the fire at all? What if she'd lived? They tested the remains again. The burnt bone pulled from the fireplace was confirmed to be from Sadie, but only a small piece of the femur. And bone dating suggested it had not burned in the same heat cycle as the rest of the house. It had been burned years later, which meant she survived the fire, Lila whispered, and died later. Her voice on the tape, her presence in the basement, it all aligned. Lila now believed Sadie had been held captive, potentially for years. Crowley may have taken her after the blaze raised her in isolation, and when she grew too old, when she ceased to resemble his Sadie, he replaced her again. The other girls. The cycle. But the tape suggested something else. Sadie had spoken after Elizabeth was killed. Which may mean Crowley didn't act alone. Lila contacted Hallstrom. What if someone helped him? Someone who still lives here. He paused. That would explain the sealed basement, why it stayed hidden, why the police never found it. It also explained how someone accessed the fireplace later, to burn a single bone to create a false ending. The implication shattered everything Lila thought she understood. This wasn't just a man's obsession. It was a shared secret. Lila walked the streets of Cheshire Hollow in silence that night, staring at porches and closed windows, wondering who still remembered the fire and who had helped erase its truth. Then she passed the general store. the one where Martin Crowley had once worked briefly in the 70s. Its current owner was closing up, but in the window hung an old photo, a collage from a school fundraiser in 1971. It showed a group of adults holding donation jars. Lila recognized Thomas Whitaker, and next to him, Martin Crowley. And just behind them, smiling faintly, stood another man. One Lila recognized immediately, Sheriff Edgar Dale, the man who'd run the first investigation, who had declared the cause of the fire accidental, who had claimed Crowley's remains were identified by tooth fragments. The same Sheriff Dale who died of natural causes in 1998 eulogized as a man of honor. The evidence was circumstantial, but the possibility was clear. Crowley hadn't acted alone, and the town in its silence had protected them both. Lila could hardly breathe as she stared at the photo, Sheriff Edgar Dale, smiling, arm lightly around Crowley's shoulder in camaraderie. The image was grainy, the moment innocent on the surface, but Lila had seen enough in her time with the Bureau to know predators often cloaked themselves in respectability. Uniforms, community service, carefully cultivated reputations. Back at the station, she dug deeper into Sheriff Dale's files. Old casework, especially regarding the Whitaker fire, was thin. Too thin. Most reports were typewritten with vague statements: house consumed. Likely cause electrical. Suspect deceased. Remains recovered. But the autopsy reports were missing. So were the dental confirmations that had allegedly ID'd Crowley's remains. Buried, hidden, possibly never done. The deeper she looked, the more it unraveled. Crowley had disappeared. Dale had declared him dead. And the town had accepted it because they wanted to. Because grief was cleaner than ambiguity. Safer, but Dale had likely known better. He'd closed the case without real forensics, citing urgency and community closure. The media coverage was minimal. The fire, brutal as it was, faded fast from public concern. Lila now knew that wasn't coincidence. She widened the search beyond Cheshire Hollow, checked for any unsolved cases involving missing children in the Tri-County area between 1975 and 1995. A staggering number appeared. Some as recent as 1998. A few were disturbingly close in pattern. Girls, brown hair, soft features. Some with the name Sadie or something phonetically similar: Sarah, Susie, Sally. They'd all vanished with little trace. The file that broke her, though, was dated October 1993. A 7-year-old girl named Madeline Cross disappeared from a church picnic in Forest Pines, 30 miles south. Witnesses remembered her last being seen chasing a red ball near the woods. No sign of a struggle. No body. Just gone. What chilled Lila, the witness description of a man in a brown coat with a limp who offered her a song and a secret. The same phrase Sadie sang in the lullaby. Lila phoned Hallstrom. Crowley's still alive. And if I'm right, he had an accomplice. Dale wasn't just a passive sheriff. He covered it up. Dale's dead, Hallstrom reminded her. We can't question him. No, she agreed. But we can talk to his son. Gary Dale still lived in Cheshire Hollow. He'd inherited the old Dale farmhouse on the east side of town. Never married, no kids. Quiet. A groundskeeper at the local cemetery. The irony. Lila visited him under the pretense of looking into cemetery records. Gary was polite but guarded. Thin in his 50s with watery blue eyes and hands that fidgeted more than seemed natural. Inside his office sat a wooden box with burned edges. Decorative. Probably a keepsake from his father. You knew Martin Crowley? Lila asked casually, eyes still on the box. Gary stiffened. Dad did. Said he was strange. Never let me around him. Funny, Lila said. There's a photo of the three of you at a fundraiser. Gary blinked too fast. I was just a kid. You were 27. A long pause. Then Gary stood. I think we're done. She didn't push. Not yet. That night, Lila returned to the station and filed an affidavit. The next morning, she and Hallstrom returned to the Dale house with a warrant. Inside the old decorative box was what they feared and more. A bundle of faded photos, girls all roughly the same age, some with dates on the back. Some bore the name Sadie scribbled on the margin, regardless of their real names. A few had been edited faces scratched out, others circled in red ink, and beneath the stack, a cassette tape labeled Winter S. Lila slipped it into a recorder. A lullaby. Then a girl's voice. "My name is Sadie, but that's not my name anymore." She sounded older than the original Sadie. Different accent. But the tone, the training was the same. Crowley had repeated the cycle. Hallstrom paced. "You think Gary was involved?" Lila shook her head. "He's weak. I think his father was." And Crowley left these tapes for Dale to listen to. Like souvenirs, and the bone in the fireplace. A warning, or a gift. A twisted kind of farewell. "Thanks for your help, here's closure." But not real closure, only manipulation. They arrested Gary for obstruction and possession of illegal material. He claimed ignorance, that his father never explained the tapes, that he'd never opened the box. But DNA would soon prove the bone was not from the original Sadie Whittaker. Instead, it belonged to Madeline Cross, the girl from the picnic. They now had proof Crowley was active long after 1979. The manhunt turned federal. Interpol flagged a match on a passport issued in Belize under the name David Marley. The man's photo bore eerie resemblance to an aged Crowley. Most recent entry, Honduras, 2019. Too late to track now, but not impossible. Lila pushed to reopen all cases tied to Crowley's pattern. 23 files in total. All girls. All Sadies. And one final detail surfaced in the last days of her fieldwork. In 1994, a woman in a small-town diner in Kansas reported a strange man dining with a girl he called Sadie. The girl appeared sedated, hair braided in thick pigtails. She left behind a cloth doll stitched from an old shirt. The waitress kept it for years, eventually stored it in her attic. When agents retrieved it, a note was discovered inside, scrawled in small, uneven handwriting. "My name was Carrie. I want to go home." Leela sat alone in her motel room, the sun bleeding out over the horizon through a dirty window pane. Her walls were covered in printed photographs, strings of red thread and pinned documents. A crime board of ghosts. Each thread led to a different girl. Each document held a name, changed a timeline, erased, or a body never found. They were Carrie, Madeline, Sophia, Elaine. They were Sadie, and still Martin Crowley was nowhere. The FBI ramped up the search, following the discovery of the Fireplace bone fragment and the cassette tapes. International partners were contacted. Border agents were briefed. Facial recognition tech reactivated. But Crowley had always been a phantom. Every time they thought they were close, he slipped back into myth. The house in Cheshire Hollow was combed from attic to basement. Under a loose floorboard in the master bedroom, agents found a journal. Faded, written in dense, slanted cursive. Not Crowley's handwriting, but someone else's. A woman. Most of the entries were mundane at first: recipes, daily chores, weather notes. Then it turned dark. March 5th, 1983. He's brought another one. Says her name is Sadie. She's missing a front tooth. She cried all night. I gave her soup. He doesn't like when I feed them. He says it makes them harder to train. March the 12th, 1983. The fire didn't destroy everything. I buried the others, near the orchard. I marked it with a rock shaped like a heart. This wasn't a co-conspirator. It was a captive. Possibly Crowley's own mother or another woman under his control. They excavated the orchard on the old Whittaker property. 12 bodies, all children. Only 6 were ever matched with open missing persons cases. The rest remained Jane Does. National headlines swarmed the case again. News vans parked outside Cheshire Hollow. Locals locked their doors tighter at night, realizing the pleasant past they'd believed in had been painted over something rotten. And Lila, she didn't rest. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the field office. No return address, just an envelope hand-printed in block letters. For the lady who found Sadie. Inside was a folded map of the Great Smoky Mountains. A red X marked a spot near the Appalachian Trail, deep in Tennessee woodland. Taped to the bottom of the letter was a familiar scrap of blue gingham cloth, the same fabric Sadie Whitaker was wearing in her only surviving school photo. Was Crowley taunting her, or trying to end it? Lila debated protocol, but in the end, she went alone. She hiked for hours. No trail, just instinct and the rough sketch on the map. By sunset, she found it, a dugout pit almost ritualistic in appearance. Ashes, scorched wood. Nearby a stone etched with a girl's name, Carrie, and next to it a shallow grave, carefully marked, tended to even. Inside a child's dress, a cassette tape. No body. The tape played only silence. Lila sat down on a log and stared at the horizon. Crowley had either died out here finishing his twisted game or he'd moved on somewhere else, some other Sadie. But it felt final. A burial. A full circle. She left the site untouched. She filed her report. But she kept the dress. Back in Cheshire Hollow, a memorial was held for the victims. Sadie Whitaker, Madeline Cross, Carrie Thompson, the unknown ones too. The town gathered in the old church. Hymns were sung. Names read aloud. Even Gary Dale sat quietly in the back, no longer hiding from the legacy his father helped conceal. As for Lila, she didn't return to D.C. immediately. She stayed in town, watched the sun set over that little mountain community still struggling to reclaim its soul. In time, she visited the Whitaker house one last time, what remained of it anyway. The charred beams, the old swing set rusted but still standing. A bird's nest now sat in its crook, and as the wind shifted through the trees, she thought she heard it soft, almost lost. My name is Sadie, but that's not my name anymore. A lullaby swallowed by the forest, gone but never forgotten.